There are rooms in your life you only recognize as prisons long after you have escaped them. They are not always places of overt unhappiness. Sometimes, they are the most comfortable rooms of all, furnished with the soft cushions of routine and predictability. They are the spaces we build to keep ourselves safe, where the windows are just high enough that we can see the sky but cannot be seen from the street, and the doors are locked not from the outside, but from within. I had lived in such a room for years, a quiet, carefully curated existence where I was the sole occupant and architect. I called it contentment, I called it independence, I called it peace. I did not realize, until Julian, that it was simply a well-appointed form of loneliness. He did not break the door down. He simply stood on the other side of it, night after night, his presence a low, steady hum of possibility, and waited for me to find the courage to turn the key. It began, as most of my life's significant moments seemed to, in silence. The only sounds in the vast, cathedral-like space of Julian's loft were the rhythmic sigh of the HVAC system and the distant, mournful cry of a city train bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. On the television across the room, the credits of some forgotten film were rolling, a silent cascade of white names against a black background, the light they cast painting our still forms in flickering shades of gray. Julian was asleep, his head resting on my shoulder, a dead weight of profound trust that felt both immensely fragile and impossibly heavy. His breath, warm and smelling faintly of the whiskey we had shared hours earlier, puffed against the fabric of my shirt, a tiny, rhythmic anchor in the deep ocean of the night. I sat perfectly still, a statue carved from anxiety and a desperate, aching tenderness, my entire consciousness focused on the points of contact between us. The heavy warmth of his head, the solid line of his shoulder and arm pressed against my side, the way his fingers were loosely curled against my thigh. This was the third time in as many weeks that our late night of work and quiet commiseration had ended like this, a slow, gravitational slide from opposite ends of his enormous leather sofa into this shared, ambiguous space. Each time, it had been an accident of proximity and exhaustion, a slow-motion collapse he had initiated without, it seemed, any conscious thought. He would grow quiet, his normally vibrant energy draining out of him until he was just a man, tired and burdened, and then he would lean. The first time, it had been a brief, startling pressure before he jerked awake, muttering an apology. The second, he had stayed for a full 10 minutes before shifting away in his sleep. But tonight, he was gone. He had surrendered completely to whatever exhausted peace he had found here, pressed against me, and I was left alone in the quiet dark to try and decipher the meaning of his surrender. My heart was a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of my ribs, each thump a word I could not say. Please, please, please. I did not know what I was pleading for. For him to wake up and move away, releasing me from this exquisite torture. For him to stay exactly where he was forever, anchoring me to a reality I had only ever allowed myself to dream of. Being my boss, Julian was a man defined by intention and precision. Every choice he made, from the stark, minimalist design of our office to the exact shade of cerulean blue he chose for a client's branding, was deliberate. He moved through the world with a kind of effortless authority that I, in my quiet, observational way, had always found mesmerizing. To see him like this, unguarded and unconscious, was to see a language I did not understand. Was this just the meaningless physics of a tired body seeking the nearest point of stability? Or was it a message, sent from some deep, subconscious part of him that was not bound by the strictures of our professional relationship or the unspoken rules of our friendship? I spent what felt like hours cataloging the sensory details, trying to solve the equation of him. The scent of his shampoo, a clean, subtle mix of sandalwood and something green, like crushed leaves. The faint stubble on his cheek grazing the soft cotton of my t-shirt. The sheer, physical reality of him, so close and so real, a stark contrast to the ghost of him I carried around in my head all day. In that moment, holding my breath so as not to disturb him, I felt like a photographer in a darkroom, watching an image slowly emerge in the chemical bath, a truth developing in the deep, quiet darkness, terrified that any sudden movement might overexpose the moment and ruin it forever. I had met Julian Thorne 2 years earlier, during what I privately referred to as the Great Beige period of my life. I was a freelance photographer, technically proficient but creatively adrift, shooting corporate headshots and sterile product photos that paid the bills but slowly leached the color from my world. My portfolio was competent, my life was stable, and my soul felt like it was slowly being paved over with concrete. I found his job posting on a design forum, a small, unassuming call for an in-house photographer at a boutique creative agency called Meridian. The name itself was evocative, suggesting direction, a turning point. I sent in my portfolio with little expectation, my work feeling entirely too conventional for an agency whose website was a stunning, interactive piece of art in its own right. He called me himself the next day. His voice on the phone was exactly as I would come to know it, warm, resonant, and buzzing with a restless energy that seemed to crackle through the receiver. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He told me he saw something in a series of personal photos I had tucked away at the very end of my portfolio, candid, black and white shots of rain-slicked city streets at night, images I had taken for myself, full of shadow and lonely beauty. He said, and I remember the words exactly because they were the first stones to fall from the wall I had built around myself. Anyone can take a picture of a product. I need someone who can take a picture of a feeling. I think you can do that. Our first meeting was in the office that would become my second home. It was a converted warehouse in the industrial district, all exposed brick, polished concrete floors, and soaring ceilings. Sunlight poured through massive, grid-paned windows, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny, glittering galaxies. And in the center of it all was Julian. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30 or 31 at the time, with a confident, easy posture and eyes that were a startling, intelligent gray. He moved with the fluid grace of a former athlete. I would later learn he'd been a collegiate swimmer, and he greeted me with a firm handshake and a smile that seemed to generate its own light. He was, in a word, incandescent. He burned so brightly that it was impossible not to feel drawn into his orbit, to feel a little warmer, a little more alive, just by being near him. He hired me on the spot, and my life began to change. Working at Meridian was like stepping from a black and white film into glorious Technicolor. Julian was a demanding boss, a perfectionist who pushed his team to create work that was not just good, but meaningful. He saw potential in me that I had long since written off. He gave me assignments that terrified and thrilled me, sending me to capture the quiet dignity of an old craftsman in his workshop or the chaotic energy of a music festival. He would look at my contact sheets, his head tilted, his expression intensely focused, and he would point to a single frame, one I might have overlooked, and say, "There. That's it. That's the story." He taught me to see again, not just with my eyes, but with my heart. Our friendship grew organically from the fertile ground of late nights and shared creative passion. It started with shop talk over takeout containers at our desks, then evolved into post-work drinks at a quiet bar down the street, and eventually, into something deeper. He learned about my quiet, solitary life, my love for old books and long, aimless walks. I learned about his restless ambition, his complicated relationship with his overbearing father, and the ghost of a long-term relationship with a woman named Claire that had ended a year before I met him, leaving a subtle but persistent shadow in its wake. He was more extroverted, a natural center of gravity in any room, while I was the quiet observer in the corner. We were a study in contrasts, yet we fit together, our disparate energies balancing each other out. He drew me out of my shell, and I think, provided him with a quiet space to land, a place where he did not have to be Julian Thorne, creative director, but could just be Julian. My feelings for him were a secret garden I tended to in the quietest hours of the night. It was a gentle, slow-growing thing, rooted in admiration and nurtured by the countless small kindnesses he showed me. The way he would bring me a coffee in the morning without asking, remembering exactly how I took it. The way his eyes would find mine across a crowded room, sharing a silent joke. The way he would sometimes place a hand on my shoulder when reviewing my work, a casual, friendly gesture that would send a jolt of electricity straight through my system. I was a master of self-containment, and I kept these feelings locked away in a part of my heart that no one else was allowed to see. He was my boss. He was my friend. He was, I assumed, completely straight. These were the boundaries, the walls of the room I had built for myself, and I believed they were insurmountable. To even consider anything more felt like a betrayal of the beautiful, uncomplicated friendship we had built, a risk I was utterly unwilling to take. The potential loss was too great. So I stayed in my safe, quiet room, content to watch his light from a distance, never imagining he might one day come looking for me in the dark. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, tectonic grinding of plates, a fundamental change in the landscape of our relationship. It began with the loss of the Atherton account. Atherton was a legacy brand, a maker of high-end mechanical watches, and landing them had been a massive coup for our small agency. Julian had poured himself into the project for 6 solid months. It was meant to be his masterpiece, the work that would elevate Meridian from a promising upstart to a major player. He lived and breathed it. I watched him sketch ideas on napkins at lunch, heard him murmuring taglines in his sleep when he crashed on the office sofa after a 48-hour session, and saw the raw, unadulterated joy on his face when he presented the final campaign. It was brilliant, a perfect fusion of old-world elegance and modern artistry. And they loved it, until they did not. A corporate buyout, a new marketing director with a pre-existing relationship with a rival agency, a sudden and brutal change of direction. The reasons were cold, corporate, and impersonal, but the result was devastating. Julian got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the studio, editing photos from our final Atherton shoot, when I heard the sound of his office door closing with a sharp, definitive click that was entirely out of character. A few minutes later, he walked out, his face pale, his usually vibrant gray eyes looking dull and flat, like stones at the bottom of a river. He gathered the whole team, his voice steady but hollow, and told us the news. He tried to frame it as a lesson, a bump in the road, but we all saw the truth. He was shattered. The light had gone out of him. That night, everyone else went home, offering quiet, sympathetic condolences. I stayed. I could not bring myself to leave him alone in that vast, silent office, a king in a suddenly empty castle. I found him in his office, not raging, not breaking things, but just sitting in his chair, staring out the window at the city lights as they began to prick the deepening twilight. The perfect, confident armor he wore every day was gone, and in its place was a vulnerability so raw it was difficult to look at. I did not say much. I just made a pot of coffee, sat in the chair opposite his desk, and waited. We sat in silence for over an hour, the quiet a shared space between us, and in that silence, something changed. He was no longer just my boss, and I was no longer just his employee. The professional architecture that had defined our relationship crumbled away, leaving only 2 people in a quiet room, one of whom was in pain, and one of whom would have done anything to ease it. He finally spoke, his voice raspy. I feel like a fraud, Leo. He did not look at me, his gaze still fixed on the indifferent city. I sell people stories about authenticity and legacy, and it's all just vapor. It can all be erased with a single phone call. I wanted to offer him some grand, comforting wisdom, but I had none. So I just offered him the truth. The work wasn't vapor, Julian. It was real. I was there. I photographed it. What they did doesn't change what we made. He finally turned to look at me, and in his eyes, I saw a profound, bone-deep weariness. It was a look that went beyond the loss of a client. It was the exhaustion of a man who had been running on ambition and willpower for so long that he had forgotten how to simply be still. That night, he asked me to stay, to just sit with him on the sofa in the main office space while he had a whiskey. And that night, for the first time, he fell asleep, his head slumping against my shoulder for just a moment before he woke with a start. It was the first tremor before the earthquake. The catalyst had been introduced, and the ground beneath my feet had begun to feel profoundly, terrifyingly unstable. The ritual was born from that night of shared silence and defeat. It was not spoken of, not planned, but it unfolded with the quiet inevitability of a season changing. The late nights at the office became a regular occurrence. Julian threw himself back into his work with a desperate, frantic energy, trying to fill the void left by the Atherton failure. He was driven by a fear I could see shimmering just beneath his skin, a terror that his one big shot was gone and he would never get another. I became his silent co-conspirator in these nocturnal work sessions, staying long after the last designer had gone home, my presence a quiet, steadying constant in the frantic hum of his anxiety. I told myself I was staying out of loyalty, out of friendship, out of a sense of duty to the man who had given my career a new life. It was a lie, of course, or at least not the whole truth. I stayed because I could not leave. I was a planet caught in his gravitational pull, and the thought of breaking orbit was unbearable. After a week of this, of us being the last two souls in the building, he made the first real move. It was almost 3 in the morning, and I was packing my camera bag, my body aching with fatigue. He was standing by the massive windows, looking out at the sleeping city. "Don't go," he said, his voice soft, not a command but a plea. "It's late. The trains have stopped. Just crash on my couch. The loft is just a few blocks away. It's ridiculous for you to trek all the way back to your place." I hesitated, 1,000 alarms going off in my head. This was a line, a new one, but the exhaustion in his voice was so genuine, and the thought of leaving him alone was so painful, that I agreed. His loft was as beautiful and intimidating as he was, a cavernous space with 20-foot ceilings and a wall of windows that offered a breathtaking panorama of the city skyline. It was a space designed for entertaining, for success, but that night, it just felt big and empty. He gave me a blanket and a pillow, and I settled onto the enormous leather sofa that felt like it could seat a dozen people. He disappeared into his bedroom, the door closing with a soft click. I lay there in the dark, my heart hammering, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of his home. It was the first night of the ritual, the first night I spent under his roof, separated by a few dozen feet and a closed door. It felt both illicit and achingly domestic. I fell asleep imagining the space on the other side of that door, a sanctum I would never be invited into, and I felt the familiar pang of a yearning so deep it felt like a part of my own bone structure. The couch became a semi-regular occurrence over the next month. It always came with a plausible excuse, a looming deadline, a sudden burst of late-night inspiration, a storm that made travel difficult. I accepted every time. I was a willing participant in the construction of this new, fragile reality. Then, one night, the architecture of our arrangement shifted again. He had been particularly brutalized by a difficult client meeting, and the exhaustion was rolling off him in visible waves. As I was setting myself up on the couch, he appeared in the doorway of his bedroom, a silhouette against the dim light from within. "The couch is awful," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "I've slept on it. It's like a rock. My bed is that's huge. There's plenty of room. Just take the other side." My breath caught in my throat. This was not a line. It was a chasm, and he was asking me to step across it. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to say no, to maintain the last shred of plausible deniability, to protect myself. But the irrational, hopeful, foolish part of my heart, the part that had been secretly in love with him for 2 years, whispered, yes. I mumbled something about not wanting to impose, but he just shook his head. "Don't be ridiculous, Leo. We're both exhausted. It's just sleeping. It was just sleeping." He had given me the out, the perfectly reasonable explanation that stripped the moment of any deeper meaning. And because I was a coward, I took it. His bedroom was like the rest of the loft, large and minimalist, dominated by a king-sized bed that looked like a vast expanse of white in the darkness. The air smelled of him, that clean, sandalwood scent, and it was intoxicating. I lay down on the far edge of the mattress, my body rigid, my muscles coiled as tight as springs. I kept a careful, deliberate foot of space between us, creating a no-man's land in the center of the bed. Julian collapsed onto his side, facing away from me, and was seemingly asleep in minutes. I lay awake for hours, acutely aware of every shift of his weight, every soft breath he took. I was in his bed. The thought repeated itself in my mind like a mantra, both a prayer and a curse. The first touch came a few nights later, in the same scenario. I had woken from a shallow, anxious sleep to find that the space between us had vanished. In his sleep, he had rolled over, and his arm was thrown across my waist, his body spooned against my back. His breathing was deep and even, the picture of unconsciousness. My entire body went rigid. I was trapped, pinned by the casual, crushing weight of his arm. I should have moved. I should have gently extricated myself and re-established the boundary. But I could not. The warmth of his body seeping through my shirt was a profound comfort, a heat that seemed to reach all the cold, lonely places inside me. I lay there, barely breathing, until the sun began to lighten the sky, my desperate hope warring with my cynical certainty. It was just sleep, a meaningless, unconscious movement. It had to be. But the ritual continued, and it escalated. The shared bed became the new normal on the nights I stayed over. The unconscious touches became more frequent. He would find me in his sleep, his hand resting on my hip, his head finding its way to my shoulder, his leg tangled with mine. He was the unknowing initiator, always providing himself the perfect alibi of sleep, and I was the quiet observer, a silent accomplice to these ambiguous acts of intimacy. My nights became a torment of analysis. I would lie awake, his arm around me, and I would try to decode the pressure of his hand, the rhythm of his breathing. Was it the deep, slow breath of genuine sleep, or the shallower breath of someone awake and pretending? I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I desperately wanted to find a specific culprit, intention. I was losing my mind, caught in a beautiful, terrifying limbo. The room I had built to keep myself safe was gone, and I was now living in a space he had designed, a place with no clear walls and no fixed rules, and I was both more terrified and more hopeful than I had ever been in my life. The crossing of the Rubicon happened on a Thursday. It was late autumn, and a cold, persistent rain had been lashing against the windows of the loft all evening, insulating us from the rest of the world. We had ordered in pizza and worked on a new pitch, the atmosphere comfortable and domestic in a way that had started to feel almost normal. But beneath the surface, the tension was a wire pulled taut between us. The ritual had been going on for nearly 2 months, a silent conversation of touch and proximity that had reached a point where it could no longer be sustained by the flimsy excuse of sleep. The ambiguity had become a weight too heavy to bear. We both knew it, though neither of us would say it. We went to bed early, the sound of the rain a constant, soothing rush. As had become the norm, I lay on my side, facing the edge of the bed, my back to him. I waited, my body humming with a nervous energy, for the familiar, unconscious shift, for the warmth of him to press against my back. But it did not come. He remained on his side of the bed, a cool expanse of sheet separating us. The silence stretched, thicker and more charged than ever before. It was not the comfortable silence of two friends sharing a space, nor the empty silence of two strangers. It was a silence full of questions, a breathing, living thing in the darkness between us. I could hear that his breathing was not the deep, even rhythm of sleep. It was quiet, but it was the breath of a man who was wide awake and thinking. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I felt a cold dread mix with a wild, irrational hope. Maybe this was the end. Maybe he had realized what was happening, the lines we were blurring, and he was re-establishing the boundary, pulling back for good. The thought was a sharp, physical pain. After all this time in the gray area, a return to the stark black and white of our old friendship felt like an unbearable loss. I would rather live in this limbo forever than go back to the way things were. I lay there, feigning sleep, my eyes squeezed shut, for what felt like an eternity. Then, his voice, so quiet it was almost a part of the rain. "Leo." I did not answer immediately. My throat was tight, my mind racing. To answer was to admit I was awake, to shatter the last vestiges of the fiction we had been maintaining. It was to step out onto the wire with him, with no guarantee of a safety net below. I took a breath, the air shuddering in my lungs. Yeah, I whispered back, my own voice sounding foreign and shaky. There was another long pause. I could feel him shift, the mattress dipping slightly as he moved. I knew, without seeing, that he had rolled over to face my back. I could feel the heat of his gaze on my shoulder blades. I remained perfectly still, a creature frozen in the sights of a predator, though I did not know if the danger was to my heart or from it. "Are you okay?" he asked, the question so simple, yet so loaded. He was not asking about my day or my work. He was asking about this, about the space between us, about the unspoken thing that had been growing in the dark for months. I finally found the courage to move. I rolled over slowly, deliberately, until I was facing him. In the dim light filtering in from the city, I could just make out his features. His gray eyes were wide, luminous in the shadows, and they were fixed on mine. His expression was one I had never seen on him before. It was stripped of all his usual confidence, all his easy authority. It was just raw, unguarded vulnerability. He looked as terrified as I felt. We just looked at each other for a long moment, the rain drumming a soft tattoo on the glass. The silence was no longer a chasm, but a bridge. He was inviting me to cross it. And I knew, in that instant, that I had to. He swallowed, a small, audible sound in the quiet room. "Would it be," he started, his voice a low, hesitant murmur, "would it be wrong if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, impossibly fragile and immensely powerful. It was not a proposition, not a move. It was a plea for permission. It was a confession of desire, wrapped in a question of morality, of right and wrong. He was giving me all the power. He was giving me the choice to preserve the comfortable room of our friendship, or to step with him into this wild, unknown territory. And in his eyes, I saw the answer he was hoping for. I saw the same desperate, aching yearning that I had been hiding for years. I did not trust myself to speak, so I just shook my head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. No, it wouldn't be wrong. He moved with an agonizing slowness, closing the final few inches between us. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, the touch tentative and questioning. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion or frantic need. It was a kiss of discovery, of profound, heartbreaking relief. It was soft and hesitant, and it tasted of whiskey and rain and the silent, terrifying truth we had finally allowed ourselves to speak. It was the answer to a question I had not even realized I had been asking for 2 years. And as I kissed him back, letting all the walls I had so carefully constructed crumble into dust, I felt the unmistakable, terrifying, and glorious sensation of a key finally turning in a lock I had long since forgotten was there. The morning after was a study in dissonance. I awoke slowly, coming to consciousness in a haze of warmth and contentment. Julian was still asleep, his arm draped over my chest, his face peaceful in the pale dawn light filtering through the windows. The memory of the kiss, of the hours of quiet, tentative touches and whispered confessions that followed, was a warm, glowing ember in my chest. For the first time, there was no ambiguity. There was no pretext of sleep. There was just this, us, a new, fragile, and beautiful reality. I allowed myself a moment of pure, unadulterated happiness, a feeling so foreign and so potent that it almost brought tears to my eyes. I felt like I had been holding my breath for 2 years and had finally been allowed to exhale. But as the sun rose higher, painting the room in the harsh, unforgiving light of day, the atmosphere began to change. Julian stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He saw me, and for a fleeting second, his expression was soft, a mirror of the contentment I felt. Then, recognition dawned, and something else followed immediately after. A shadow, a flicker of panic that was as quick and as startling as a camera flash. He pulled his arm away as if he had been burned. He sat up, running a hand through his already messy hair, and did not look at me. I need to make some coffee," he mumbled, his voice a low rasp. He swung his legs out of bed and was gone, leaving a sudden, shocking cold in the space where he had been. The silence that descended on the loft was entirely different from the charged silence of the night before. This was a cold, brittle silence, full of regret and unspoken fear. I lay in his bed, the sheets smelling of him, and felt a familiar dread begin to creep back in, extinguishing the warm ember in my chest. I heard him moving around in the kitchen, the clatter of the coffee grinder sounding unnaturally loud and violent. I got up, my heart a leaden weight, and put on my clothes from the night before. When I walked into the main living area, he was standing with his back to me, staring out the window, a mug of coffee clutched in his hands like a shield. "Morning," I said, my voice trying for a casualness I did not feel. "Morning," he replied, without turning around. The word was clipped, sterile. He was no longer Julian, my friend, the man who had kissed me with such heartbreaking tenderness. He was Julian Thorne, my boss, and a vast, professional distance had suddenly opened up between us. I was no longer a welcome guest in his home. I was an employee who had overstayed his welcome. The shift was so abrupt, so jarring, that it felt like a physical blow. The days that followed were some of the most miserable of my life. The ritual was broken. The late night stopped. Julian became a ghost in the office, communicating with me only through emails and brief, formal interactions in front of other people. He avoided being alone with me at all costs. If he saw me in the break room, he would turn and walk the other way. He canceled our one-on-one review meetings. The warmth, the camaraderie, the easy friendship that had been the bedrock of my life for 2 years, it was all gone, replaced by a polite, excruciating coldness. He had not just closed the door he had opened, he had locked it, bolted it, and piled furniture in front of it. I was in agony. I replayed the kiss, the entire night, over and over in my head, searching for what I had done wrong. Had I misread everything? Was the kiss just a moment of weakness for him, a temporary lapse in judgment brought on by loneliness and stress? Had he woken up filled with regret, horrified at what he had done with his subordinate, his friend? The uncertainty was a corrosive acid, eating away at my confidence, my happiness, my sense of self. The hope he had ignited in me had curdled into a bitter cocktail of shame and confusion. I felt like a fool. The quiet observer had finally stepped into the frame, and in doing so, had seemingly ruined the entire composition. After a week of this silent, cold war, I knew I could not go on. The limbo of our ritual had been painful, but this new reality was unbearable. It was not just my heart that was breaking, our work was suffering. The creative synergy we had shared was gone, and the entire office could feel the frost emanating from his office. I had to know the truth, even if the truth was the thing I feared most. I had to force the confrontation. I waited until everyone else had left for the day, and I walked to his office. The door, which he always used to leave open, was closed. I knocked, my hand trembling slightly. "Come in," his voice called, sounding tired and distant. I opened the door and stepped inside. He was at his desk, staring at his computer screen, though I could tell he was not really seeing it. He looked up, and when he saw it was me, that guarded, panicked look flickered across his face again. He immediately stood up, creating a physical barrier of the desk between us. "Leo, what can I do for you?" His tone was formal, detached. It was the voice of a man trying desperately to pretend that the most significant night of our lives had never happened. And I just broke. The carefully constructed calm I had been trying to project crumbled. "Stop it," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the sterile air of the office. "Just, please, stop." He looked genuinely confused. "Stop what?" "This," I said, gesturing vaguely to the space between us, to the coldness, to the pretense. "Stop acting like I'm a stranger. Stop acting like last Thursday didn't happen. If it was a mistake, Julian, just have the decency to tell me it was a mistake. If you regret it, tell me you regret it. This silence, this is worse. It's cruel." The words came out in a rush, fueled by a week of pain and confusion. I felt tears pricking at my eyes, and I hated myself for my lack of control. He stared at me, his face a mask of conflict. For a long moment, I thought he was going to give me some corporate, evasive answer, that he would shut me down completely. But then, something in him seemed to break. The rigid, defensive posture collapsed. He sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, and a sound came from him that was somewhere between a sob and a strangled gasp. It was the sound of a man who had been holding himself together with sheer force of will, and whose will had finally failed. He finally looked up at me, his gray eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and his face was etched with a misery that mirrored my own. "I don't know what to do, Leo," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am so scared." His confession, so simple and so raw, was not what I had expected. I had prepared myself for rejection, for pity, for anger. I had not prepared myself for fear. His vulnerability disarmed me completely, my own anger and hurt dissolving in the face of his palpable distress. I closed the office door, shutting out the rest of the world, and walked around the desk, pulling the visitor's chair close to his. The chasm between us was gone, replaced by a shared island of confusion and fear. "Scared of what?" I asked softly, my voice gentle now. He took a shaky breath, not looking at me, his gaze fixed on his hands, which were clenched together on the desk. "Of everything. Of this. Of what it means. I've spent my entire life on a set path, Leo. College, career, Claire, it was all laid out. The things a person like me is supposed to do. The way a person like me is supposed to feel. I build my entire life, this entire company, on playing it safe. On knowing the rules. On being in control." He finally lifted his eyes to mine, and the look in them was one of profound, desperate honesty. "And then there's you. And with you, there are no rules. I don't know what I'm doing. Nothing is safe. And it terrifies me," he continued, the words spilling out of him now that the dam had broken. He told me that the late nights, the couch, the bed, none of it was an accident. He had been so lonely, so adrift after the Atherton failure, and my quiet, steady presence was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that anchored him. He found himself manufacturing reasons to keep me close, drawn to a warmth and a peace he could not find anywhere else. He admitted that he had been awake every single time he had reached for me in the dark, his heart pounding, hoping I would not pull away, but always giving himself the plausible deniability of sleep because he was too much of a coward to do it in the light of day. "That kiss," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "was the most honest thing I've done in years. And the moment I did it, the moment I felt you kiss me back, all I could think about the next morning was the risk. The risk to our friendship, which is the most important one I have. The risk to this company. The risk to my entire life. This whole identity I've built that suddenly doesn't feel like it fits anymore." He shook his head, a look of self-disgust on his face. "So I panicked. I ran. I tried to put everything back in its box, to pretend it never happened. Because that's what I do. I play it safe. And I hurt you in the process. And I am so sorry." Leo, hearing it all laid bare, his confusion, his fear, his intentionality, was like a key turning, unlocking all the pieces of the puzzle I had been trying to solve in the dark. He had not been playing with me. He had not been careless with my heart. He had been just as lost and terrified as I was. Only his fear was not of unrequited love, but of a love so real and so unexpected that it threatened to dismantle his entire world. In that moment, all my hurt vanished, replaced by a wave of profound empathy. I reached out, my hand covering his where they were clenched on the desk. His fingers uncurled, and he laced them with mine. The simple contact was an anchor for both of us. "You know," I said, my voice steady now, "I spent years building a safe little room for myself. I never let anyone in. I thought it was the only way to not get hurt." I squeezed his hand. "Being with you, even in all that uncertainty, was the first time I ever felt like I wanted to step outside. It was terrifying. But Julian, staying in that room was never really living. It was just waiting. Maybe we can be scared together. Maybe we can figure out the new rules as we go." A single tear traced a path down his cheek, and he did not wipe it away. He just looked at me, a fragile, hopeful dawn breaking in his exhausted eyes. "You really are the best man I've ever known," he whispered. And in that moment, in the quiet sanctuary of his office, surrounded by the ghosts of our professional lives, we began the slow, careful work of building something new. Not a fortress built on safety and rules, but a home built on the terrifying, beautiful, and honest foundation of mutual vulnerability. The conversation in his office was not a magical fix. It was a beginning, the first honest words laid down for a new foundation. We did not leave that night as triumphant lovers striding into a new dawn. We left as two exhausted, fragile people who had finally agreed to stop running from the truth and from each other. He walked me to the subway, and under the harsh fluorescent lights of the station, there was a moment of awkward hesitation, the muscle memory of our old, easy friendship warring with the new, undefined landscape of whatever we were now. He did not try to kiss me. Instead, he just reached out and squeezed my arm, his eyes holding mine for a long, searching moment. "Get home safe," he said, and the simple words were imbued with a new weight, a new meaning. It was not a casual farewell. It was a promise of care. The days that followed were a process of careful, deliberate recalibration. We began to learn a new language, one spoken not in ambiguous touches in the dark, but in quiet, intentional gestures in the light. It started with coffee. He would text me in the morning, a simple message, "Coffee." And I would meet him at the small cafe near the office, and we would sit for 20 minutes before work, just talking. We talked about everything and nothing, about work, about a film I had seen, about his frustration with a new piece of software. We were relearning how to be in each other's space without the crushing weight of unspoken things. We were rebuilding our friendship, but this time, with a new honesty woven into its very fabric. He started leaving his office door open again. The frost in the agency began to thaw. The creative energy, the easy collaboration that had been the hallmark of Meridian, slowly returned. Our colleagues, who had been walking on eggshells for weeks, visibly relaxed, the ambient tension they could not name but had all felt finally dissipating. He would come into my studio to look at my photos, and he would stand next to me, our shoulders almost touching, and the proximity was no longer a source of frantic anxiety for me, but a quiet, comforting hum of presence. He was there, and he was not going to run away. About a week after our talk, he asked me to dinner. Not a late night, post-work meal of takeout containers, but a proper dinner. At a restaurant. In public. It felt like a monumental step. I was a wreck of nerves all day, changing my shirt 3 times before I left my apartment. But the moment I saw him waiting for me outside the restaurant, a small, nervous smile on his face, my anxiety melted away. He looked just as nervous as I felt. Throughout the meal, he was attentive, present, his focus entirely on me. He asked me questions about my childhood, about my dreams before I became a photographer, things we had never talked about in all our years of friendship. He was not just my boss or my friend. He was a man trying to truly know another man. After dinner, he walked me home, all the way to my door. Under the dim glow of my apartment building's porch light, he took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine in a way that was now becoming familiar, natural. "I had a really good night, Leo," he said, his voice soft. Can I do this again? I'd like that," I said, my heart feeling so full I thought it might burst. He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, gentle press of lips that was a world away from the desperate, questioning kiss in his bed. This one was full of intention, of quiet certainty. It was a promise. Our new relationship unfolded slowly, like a photograph developing. It was a thing of quiet moments, not grand gestures. It was him bringing me a book he thought I would like. It was me making him dinner at my small apartment, the two of us navigating my tiny kitchen in a comfortable, bumping into each other dance. It was falling asleep holding hands, the simple, solid contact or reassurance that was more profound than any passionate embrace. We were healing, both from the pain of the last few weeks and from the older, deeper loneliness we had both been carrying. We were learning that intimacy was not just about physical closeness, but about creating a safe harbor for another person's vulnerabilities. He learned to be still, to exist without the need for constant motion and ambition. And I learned to be brave, to step out of the quiet, safe room of my own making and trust that he would be there to catch me. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Months later, we were lying on his sofa, the same sofa where our story had truly begun. I was reading, my head in his lap, his fingers idly tracing patterns on my arm. The television was off. The only sound was the rain and the comfortable silence between us. It struck me then, the profound difference between this moment and all those nights I had sat there, a bundle of anxiety, trying to decipher his every breath. All the fear, the uncertainty, the desperate yearning, it was gone. In its place was a deep, quiet peace, a sense of rightness that settled deep in my bones. He had stopped playing it safe, and in doing so, he had taught me that the greatest risks often lead to the safest harbors. The door to my quiet room was not just unlocked. It had been taken off its hinges entirely, leaving nothing but an open, sunlit space, big enough for two. We did not need to define what we were. We did not need labels or grand declarations. Our truth was written in the small, everyday rituals of our shared life. The way he always saved me the last of the coffee, the way I knew to leave a light on for him when he was working late, the way our hands always seemed to find each other, whether we were walking down the street or sitting across a table. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. His world of sharp, ambitious lines and my world of soft, observant shadows had merged, creating a new composition, a new story. It was a story I had once been too afraid to even imagine, a story about a man who had been my boss, then my friend, and had ultimately become the architect of my bravest and most beautiful life. He had not just given me a job. He had given me a home, not in his loft, but in the quiet, steady beating of his own unguarded heart.